Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Landscape series. Today we'll be screening Before the Lake Was Champlain. I'm David Brule, the spokesman for the Nolamika Project Incorporated. We're a nonprofit organization made up entirely of volunteers dedicated to providing the public with opportunities to learn about the history, lifeways, and persistence of Indigenous peoples in our region. In addition to the events and workshops we offer, we also serve as a communications center between you, the public, and our network of contacts. Please feel free to contact us with your questions at nolambikaproject.org, on Facebook, or at our email, nolambikaproject@gmail.com. And as always, for nonprofits like us, donations are always welcome. We always begin our events with an acknowledgement that we are all occupying and benefiting from Indigenous lands. The first peoples have lived here for tens of thousands of years in balance and reciprocity with the earth. The voices and spirits of those ancestors are still here in the air around us, and their descendants are still here among us. We must continue to be thankful to this earth and our fellow creatures with whom we share the wonderful gifts of our rivers, forests, hills, and plains. We give thanks for all good things. We want to thank two of our primary sponsors. First, the Karuna Center for Peace Building, founded 25 years ago in Amherst, Massachusetts, has an outreach that ranges across the planet to reach more than 40 countries, many of which have been affected by violence. Karuna works to support dialogue, to heal from trauma, foster reconciliation, and to build inclusive governance. Karuna, with the support from the Massachusetts Humanities Council, also works domestically and has been hosting a virtual website series entitled Erasure and Restoration, facilitated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies. Check out the website at www.karunacenter.org for more information. Another incredibly important sponsor of this series is the River Valley Co-op, based in Northampton, Massachusetts. The co-op is a retail grocery business, cooperatively owned by 11,000 community members. The co-op has operated one store in Northampton for a dozen years and plans to open a second location in East Hampton. The co-op specializes in local products and is committed to building a sustainable local food system. That was in recognition that the co-op is benefiting from land that was taken from the First Nations people. River Valley has a commitment to working with the Nolamika Project and other groups to support the work of Native American historic and cultural preservation. We are deeply indebted to filmmaker Ted Timreck, who since 1976 has been exploring and filming sites that will be the focus of the series of films that we are presenting today and for the next 2 weeks. Ted holds a research position in the associate program of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. He has been working with the museum's Arctic Studies Center since 1980. Ted has been breaking new ground with Doug Harris, as you will see. Doug Harris, whom we will meet shortly, is the moving force behind efforts to locate ceremonial stone landscapes and preserve these sites as important parts of our cultural heritage and national treasure. Together, Ted and Doug have blended scientific research methodology with Indigenous insights, knowledge, and wisdom to provide us with a unique and remarkable body of work that crosses cultural lines. In addition, a third panelist will be our good friend, Professor Frederick M. Wiseman. He's the coordinator of the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center. He's an Indigenous rights activist and author of many scholarly and popular books on archaeology, ethnohistory, and ethnobotany. During the film, please use the question and answer option as your questions for the three presenters today arise. They will be addressed at the conclusion. I'll turn the rest of the program over to Ted Timreck. All set, Ted.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. The last time we got together here, our first episode, we introduced the ceremonial stone landscapes of the Northeast. And when I started this in about 76, all I could really be sure of was that the stone ruins were mysterious. And over time, we had to get past the idea that they were only built by colonial farmers. And we had to get past the idea that they were built by Phoenicians or Celtic monks who diffused from the old world. And we got to the place where we recognized that they were probably native cultural resources. This was not an easy topic for many people to accept at the time. The scientists hated it because it didn't fit the books, and even the antiquarians didn't like it because it didn't fit their models. So the next step was to recognize that the cultures, the native cultures that built these things, were not like the native cultures that our textbooks were telling us existed in the Northeast at the time. So we went down to the Smithsonian and found out that the Arctic Study Center were making discoveries about native life in the far north, where they could verify the truth of these discoveries, that Indians' cultures, 8,000 years to the Ice Age, were far different than the cultures that got written down in our history books. So this movie is our first introduction to that idea of rather sophisticated cultures, maritime cultures, traveling the ocean, going back to the Ice Age.
Thank you, Ted. It's a great honor and joy to welcome Doug Harris, Ted Timreck, and Fred Wiseman today. Please put your questions in the Q&A and they will respond. Our first question asks our panelists, please compare and contrast the indigenous whaling hunting and the industrialized whale hunting centered in New Bedford and in Nantucket. How much did one impact or influence the other?
I guess I can try to deal with that a little bit. The Nantucket and southern New England whaling industry, of course, began with indigenous people teaching the locals about catching whales and bringing them in along the coast. I think as time went on, though, the New England whaling industry focused on whale oil, which really was part of a whole industrial revolution in interior lighting that just exploded in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so the entire idea, I guess you could say, of the Euro-American whaling industry was basically to create a commodity that could be processed and shipped and consumed in large amounts all over an area. The indigenous whaling, of course, had a completely different focus. The focus was strictly on the actual process of being able to harvest the whale, and that included all of the technology of building the boats, all the ceremony that went into the preparation and the actual traveling out to the whale fishery, and then being able to the ceremony and the behavior associated with the harpoon, and bringing it back and than the equitable distribution of the meat. So it had a completely different take, a lot more ceremonial, a lot more community rather than commodity based.
Let us not forget that the early, in the film, medicine man and tribal historic preservation officer John Brown spoke of the Narragansetts that he knew, who had been a part of the whaling experience and the use of boats out on the ocean. So that has been clarified. And I'd also like to applaud Dr. Wiseman for the work that he has been doing with the El Nu community in bringing back the ancient traditions. But it also, that points up that there are many other communities who may not be engaged in the kind of reconstruction work that Dr. Wiseman and the El Nu are doing, but there are communities like the Montaukett of Long Island who are a primary African-looking community, the Shinnecock, who are mixed African and Indian communities. The Native American can be found embedded in many different communities, both red-looking, black-looking, and white-looking. So we should not forget those.
With the recent melting of glaciers along the Labrador and Newfoundland coastlines, what new discoveries and evidence have been found to further advance the learnings described in this film?
That's a really good question. Most people don't even know about what's here at the moment along the coast. And the age of these things just keeps pushing back gradually. And there hasn't been a great deal of research beyond what we've documented. So I don't know of any major discoveries that we could put our finger on that are the kind of rather earth-shaking kinds that we've seen here. But if you move further south along, say, the Delmarva Peninsula, near Washington, D.C. and Virginia, they are coming up with discoveries both under the ocean floor and also right at the shores line that are pushing back the dates to beyond 20,000 years ago. And, short of a plug, I can only tell you to wait for the later movies that are going to come out and explain those discoveries soon.
Is there any at all DNA evidence showing relationship of Northwest Pacific indigenous with Northeast Atlantic indigenous?
I don't want to go out too far on a limb here, but I just ran across an article that was sent to me that actually did show some connection across that kind of a distance from Lansamur itself. Now, the thing is that what that really does for us in the most general way is just reiterate the idea that these 8,000, and Lansamur itself has been pushed back to 8,000 years, not 7,500. But what it shows is that the sureness of the discovery that these are Native American ancestors, and you can trace that DNA all the way up through today. But I wouldn't, not being any specialist, I wouldn't dare to go on any further than that kind of a general connection.
Has the ancient shore of glacial Lake Hitchcock been researched for human activity?
I've been hoping for that for decades.
As far as I know, of course, there's a lot of places seeing, VARB research antennas and stuff like that in Glacial Lake Hitchcock, but I don't know of much, if any, archaeology that dates back to that time period.
And to what extent has the ancient shore of the Champlain Sea in other areas of Vermont been surveyed for possible Paleo-Indian presence?
Literally surveyed for that, nothing. It's like Loring did. He went around to the farmers and looked to discover what they had found in their turned up in their landscaping. It's all by accident. It's all being built back by accident for the most part.
I think it's also important to clarify that paleo is a time period, not a tribe. And quite often it's used as though the Paleo Indian is a tribe, an early tribe, when in fact that's an anthropological term referring to a time period, not a people.
Good.
What are the similarities, if any, between Champlain beaches and those of Glacial Lake Hitchcock?
Well, I can address that a little bit just from anecdotally and from my own experience. When you drive through, let's say on Route 2 or something, through the from Lake Champlain over the mountains and then going through the Connecticut River Valley. Interestingly, the sands, the glacial outwash sands on the places where you can stop by the road are very, very similar. They're just very standard beach sands. There's no particular difference in color or texture or sorting of the material in terms of the depositional environment. And so the beaches are just standard, like Cape Cod type of beaches, only thousands and thousands of years old.
That's true. In general, I think we have not looked at beach terraces because none of our textbooks have said there were any people here, or many people, or enough people to make it worthwhile to think we could look. Once you restructure your image of what early native life might have been, then all of a sudden looking at beaches becomes a really logical archaeological endeavor. So it's going to take probably decades for the textbooks to come around and begin to describe what kind of life was going on 10 to 20,000 years ago in this area. But I think Fred is right. The main river systems that we still have today are the river systems that have the beach terraces where we should be looking at the high ends for the earliest sites. It's I don't want to simplify that because it's, the earth is complex, but once we have a model for native life that includes that kind of living, then we might have a reason to begin archaeological searching.
Well, the Turner Falls Airport site was a site that had very much a beach-like sand, and it was the one that produced the first ceremonial landscape that the United States government recognized as being of cultural significance. But that area should be the Hanneman site in particular. There were artifacts there, Paleolithic artifacts that were found that indicate that the Indians were there and were in their presence were making artifacts from stone.
What do you imagine the influence of the position of the Gulf Stream was on the sites, on the early coastal Labrador cultures?
The Gulf Stream is strong, and today we know, and ever since the Ice Age, it has pushed all the wood from the Western Hemisphere toward the Eastern Hemisphere. Just naturally, anything that floats goes from New York to Europe. So, given that, and if it hasn't changed its structure in the last 25,000 years, then the obvious implication is that things floated from here to there. Fred?
Fort Drum has now been mentioned in 2 films. Does the United States military recognize this space as an archaeological space for ancient culture? Is there any educational center in that region offering information?
I think the Army recognizes for sure now that they're sitting on ancient beach terraces that were occupied at the end of the Ice Age. No question about that. And I think they're probably pretty good about that. In terms of an educational connection, I think the movie you've just seen is we had pieces of that site in both films. I don't know of any other information. Lori Rush probably has some publications, but they're official as they are from her, but as an educational opportunity, I don't think it exists yet. I might be wrong on that.
Well, I think it's important that there is a significant archaeological program on Fort Drum, one that fully recognizes the significance of the lithics that are found there. And it was the work of Lori Rush that, and bringing in people like Dennis Stanford and who's the archaeologist?
The astronomical archaeologist.
Yeah.
Anthony Avini.
Anthony Avini, she brought him in to in fact declare that the stones that were there had been created and worked by humans. So it's something that is well known in that military community, and is they stopped developing.
One thing that's possible is if you connect the 2 movies, Great Falls, with this one, given those 2 parts, what you see is that Lori had an enormous ceremonial stone landscape there that even Anthony Avini came to understand, and it's sitting right at the position of a major maritime navigational occupation. So the message in between these 2 movies, and it takes a couple of hours to get to this stuff, is that there's the link between the ceremonialism and the link between the navigation and long distance movement of culture are linked. And this is what we find further down in New England, all along the coast.
What did the Massachusetts and Vermont coastline look like during the last Ice Age?
It was interesting. Much of the Champlain Valley, of course, was occupied by the Champlain Sea, Lake Vermont at the very end of the Ice Age. Of course, during the earlier time periods, it was completely under 5,000-6,000 feet of ice. And of course, the Massachusetts coastline extended way heck and gone out into the Atlantic. So I'll let Doug address the Massachusetts situation.
In that film we just looked at, there is a map of New England showing the water at about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So you can, if you had enough time to stare at that map for a while, you might get a better picture. And what you what you learn is that there's a whole lot of water in New England and not as much land as we take for today. And that map doesn't, like Fred said, doesn't even extend far enough east to show you how far out into the Atlantic the shoreline actually existed.
Would Lake Champlain 10,000 years ago have felt like part of the ocean?
Oh, sure. When it was the Champlain Sea, it had fin whales, belugas, seals. As a matter of fact, the last seals in Lake Champlain passed away in the 19th century. So it would have felt basically very much like the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland, a classic northern marine type of an environment.
All of New England would have just been a peninsula surrounded by ocean, all the way to the Great Lakes, certainly to the Champlain Sea, and then all the way around. So New England was just a large peninsula at that point.
Would the Northampton site be related to all of this? Would they be related at all to this time period and this maritime culture?
I'm afraid I don't have any details on the Northampton site other than its importance.
Here's a question for Fred related to Vermont. I was recently looking for any treaty agreements with tribes in Vermont. I looked for treaty lists, but was unable to find any treaties for Vermont. Mr. Wiseman, do you know of any treaties related to Vermont and where I might find a record of them?
Okay, well, there's, interesting enough, most of the Vermont was really not considered in the 17th and early 18th century treaty making agreements. The best place to look, okay, there were a series of agreements, and with Massachusetts that was initiated by the Maine Wabanakis. Probably one of the more important is the 1722 Governor Shute list of tribes that asked Massachusetts to basically lay off their attacks on Maine. There were several others during the Revolution that were initiated and worked with basically the Passamaquoddies during that period were our main people that spoke for us. The Vermont Abenakis at that time, especially Missisquoi, was considered one of the villages of what was called the Great Council Fire or Wabanaki Confederacy. You can look both of those up, Google them, and then Seven Nations of Canada treaties. Missisquoi was a signer on to several of the Ganawage and Odanak treaties of the 18th century. So just off the top of my head, you can take a Canadian viewpoint through Seven Nations, Great Council Fire, or a coastal Maine and kind of viewpoint. So Vermont was basically represented by other villages, other diplomacies that were a lot closer to Euro-American seats of power at the time.
Does evidence of ancient maritime cultures cast doubt on the idea that all original North Americans came via the Bering Land Bridge?
Well, it pretty much casts serious doubt on that as an exclusive, for sure. What it's all made of at this point, we are learning new things all the time. As I say, the film I'm working on now, we've managed to push the dates for Atlantic East Coast native existence back past 23,000 years. And that's nowhere in the textbooks. So all of that has to be redone because we just and we have the faith, I guess, that slowly the history will be rewritten. It's what I call that the glass basement of Native history. It just keeps cracking and cracking and falling through. And it's probably going to keep doing that. And as that happens, the actual arrival of who, what, and when changes, or is probably going to change. So, you know, don't bet on a one route. Fred, you got any on that?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things that we're dealing with the DNA and mitochondrial evidence, the haplogroups distribution, and so there's a lot of pathways to the Americas, ranging from Europe north along the glacial margin. There are boats along probably along the Pacific, Aleutian Islands over to northern Japan. Then there's other genetic relationships that go even through a larger oceanic, kind of a mid or even more southerly Pacific. Of course, the big question with those is, just as 30, 40 years ago, we were saying that, of course, all these structures up here in New England had to be built by Europeans or other people from elsewhere, that the indigenous people here were too stupid to pile two rocks one on top of the other. We need to think about this genetics, because if you notice that most everybody says if there is a shared haplogroup between us and Malta, of course the Maltese had to bring it to here. As Ted first posed the question in the Secrets of Lost Red Paint People, with the nature of the Gulf Stream, why not indigenous people bringing those haplogroups over to Europe? When you actually measure it, thinking about the time period of being, you can just sit in a boat in the Gulf Stream, as long as you've got enough water and capability to fish, and you'll crash on the shores of Northern Europe. You can't paddle very easily back from Europe unless you go way, way north with the Armiger, and there's a couple other little interesting currents that you can use. So, I think that everybody went everywhere.
In reference to the Bering, the point about the Bering Land Bridge, I think not to dismiss it entirely, but I think today just about most scientists are on board with the idea that across the Pacific, humans came by water. They came by boat. They call it coastal, but you still had to be maritime adapted to have a coastal migration. It's a kind of a hidden effort there, but I would say that the idea, this original question was about the maritime adaptation, and I think that in the Northern Pacific, at least through the North Pacific, that the acceptance of maritime migration is even more solid than walking across Beringia. Not that that's out of the picture, but it sure seems to fit what we know about human history in the Western Hemisphere better if you think boats and travel than if you think simply walking, as we did for the last 250 or more years.
Are there any comparisons among tools, use of red ochre or DNA of other groups indigenous in ancient times to the Arctic seas around the globe?
Yeah, it's huge. Red ochre, I mean, it's so big that it doesn't really work as an absolutely set denominator or a criteria, because it's such a big thing. However, it does show that some of the strongest use of the red ochre for ceremonial purposes is in the Northern Hemisphere. And the further north you go, the more intense the use becomes. It's early all over the globe in certain ways, but there's something about the North Atlantic in particular, where it's just It's just a very deep and early ceremonial trait that's pretty intense. But it's too big to actually point a finger and say we understand this or anything specific about it. There are huge red paint cemeteries in, for instance, Latvia on the Baltic Sea. And there are large red paint cemeteries on the coasts of Scotland or northern France, more so than you'll find. But the earliest red paint seems to be Iran or in the Middle East. But the intensity is truly in the north.
Have you found evidence of red ochre around the Champlain Sea?
Fred, you got that.
Yes, there actually are several sites, a little bit later than the time period that we're talking about, such as Boucher and others, but many of these sites are burial sites that have the red ochre, and I feel uncomfortable with discussing the nuances of the material in those burials. But traditionally in Abenaki and other Wabanaki society, red ochre was considered either earth blood or the underlying structure of life. And so they would be used in various ways of communicating with the earth as an entity or earth spirits, and also to a certain extent underwater beings such as the underwater panther and serpent. And so red ochre was exceedingly important in the past, and it still is today. It's still used. As a matter of fact, last fall we used quite a bit of it in a harvest ceremony and a end of year ceremony. So it's still up and running after all these years.
Is there a tradition among early northern maritime cultures of building in stone and creating ceremonial stone landscapes?
Yeah, it's a huge tradition, and like I say, the next movie we're about to finish will focus on that more intently.
While living in the West, I've heard suggestions from First Nations peoples that the supposed migration from Asia across the Bering Strait to this continent is a hypothesis, but that in fact it was the inhabitants of this continent who crossed across to Asia. I wonder if that would somehow explain the Ainu observations made in this film.
Did you mean Ainu?
Ainu, I did. I'm
Yes,
sorry,
okay,
I mispronounced.
Well, the Ainu are supposedly the Paleolithic time frame wise inhabitants of northern Asia, and how that's Fred can do better than I can on this, but that seems like more of a DNA issue for the future. One that might, once we clear our own ways of understanding DNA, we'll have a better way to look at those things. But at least that question from our audience reflects where questions should be going, I think.
Well, that question is a fundamental one, and one that I personally have grappled with probably for almost 50 years. When I was at the University of Arizona, I did a lot of work with archaeologists all throughout the Southwest, and I got to know a wonderful kind of pioneer woman, archaeologist named Cynthia Irwin Williams. And she had an anecdotal and fascinating story that makes, in terms of our modern canon today, makes no sense. There was an archaeological excavation that she participated in Mexico. And it was the strangest thing. The fauna that was originally found, there's the Blancan fauna, which puts it back well over 180,000 years ago. And it had human stone tools and also certain evidence of the markings or manipulating those tools. The site itself was actually capped with a volcanic ash flow that was dated. It also had was associated with certain lake microfaunas such as ostracods and diatoms, things of that sort. The big problem here is the whole site ranges from 180 to 230,000 years ago. The fauna fits that perfectly. The diatoms fits that time period perfectly. The fission track dating and thorium protactinium dating on the ash above it, sealing the site, also puts it over 180. And some of them range way back. I mean, 250,000. This is pre-modern human time periods. And I've considered that as almost as close as you can get to magic in the interface between geochronology, archaeology, and kind of what archaeologists are willing to handle. I came up with the idea that there are three things that are mutually compatible, but all three cannot be compatible at the same time. Either Cynthia Irwin Williams was a terrible archaeologist and she completely messed up or even salted the archaeological site. Salting means an archaeologist putting artifacts in a site to fake it up. So either she was a terrible archaeologist or she was a liar. The geochronology was all screwed up. And remember, we have two different types of physical dating and two different types of biometric dating using ostracods and diatoms. So either that is all messed up, or the third is that everything that we've been talking about in all of these, in this whole film and this discussion is all a bunch of bucksnort. That actually pre-humans existed in the Valley of Mexico and a little bit to the east. I can't remember which side, a little bit to the east, I believe. And maybe humans emerged here and went other places. That one site, Google it, Valsequillo, and you'll hear everything that doesn't make any sense at all. So that's been one of my favorite sites. Because I always like a lost cause, and Valsequillo is a good example of that.
I'd like to add, though, that we're in a phase right now all over the globe where we are discovering earlier hominids, pre-ancestors of human beings in different parts of the world, Siberia or the South Pacific. And I'm just guessing, Cynthia Irwin aside, and maybe they'll come back and revive her thinking, but I'm suspecting that in some future time, we're going to discover hominid remains in the Western Hemisphere. Since we're finding it all over and we're beginning to figure out how to, we have a finger bone here, we have a bit of a jaw from there. When the hominid discoveries emerge, then the whole issue of native existence being from time immemorial will make sense, because time immemorial just goes back through that glass basement I was talking about before.
This may be an ignorant question, and I don't mean to be offensive. Do the current tribal societies claim Paleo-Indian cultures as part of their own, or as ancestors, but from different cultures?
I guess I'll take a crack at that. The Wabanaki people have probably three stories that seem to relate back to the Ice Age. I'm sure that Doug must have some Narragansett and equivalent stories. So there's the story of Snowy Owl and the short oh God, I can't, Snowy Owl, I'm spacing the full name, the short-legged bear, that's right. That probably refers to a woods mastodon. And there's a couple other, so at least people that are aware of that story just accept the fact that that was a story that was just handed right straight down through. And so, you know, we've got, and I think there's Wampanoag stories. I believe there are Southern New England stories that come down. And so the idea is, at least if there is a community memory of this thing through handed down lore, most elders, at least Wabanaki elders, will say, yep, that was us.
On the Northwest coast, it's very, it's easy for scientists to accept Ice Age stories or Paleolithic stories from tribal elders in those areas, simply because the social structures are so strong. Slowly, I think scientists from the East are also becoming more willing to see direct links in terms of oral history that go back to the Ice Age. Doug does have some stories. There are other stories. We opened up the story of Great Falls with the giant beaver, a story that goes back. The acceptance of that is a cultural link, but ultimately this will also be a DNA link. And as far as I know, the DNA links from the Paleo times right through modern tribal history are pretty strong. For example, in the Lansamore burial that we just cited in this particular film, that DNA just very clearly says Native American. And one can assume that you have many, many generations before that burial and many, many generations after that are consistent. So any group that's been under cultural stress for 500 years should be expected to have trouble formulating a sense of deep, deep history. But it is happening. It's going on, and it will get better.
Is there any evidence that Northeastern seafarers traveled east, such as similarities in paleo sites found in Greenland and North America?
There's a famous story about a kayak, an Eskimo kayak, being hung up over a bar in Aberdeen, Scotland, which is only a quick symbol of the potential of that happening. It's a much longer. There have been books written about the Native American discovery of Europe that you can get. So it's out there and it's discussed, and as Fred mentioned, the Gulf Stream makes that not an unreasonable question to ask. Doug, you had some technical difficulties, did you?
I'm impressed. I'm learning that a difficulty can occur.
Okay. Well,
Is there a connection, do you think, to the ancient mariners of northern Norway who have left significant petroglyphs?
Once again, I can only refer you to our next program, the sea peoples of the ancient sea peoples of the North Atlantic, where we will deal with that issue also.
This is, of course, fascinating and interesting from a historical and scientific perspective. How does this information impact today's Indigenous people to have evidence recognized that their history here goes back 20,000 years on the East Coast? How is this information of the past informing a path for the future for all of us?
Well, that information is just being shared with the coastal Indigenous people, and we're waiting to see how they respond to it. Right now, we're engaged in communicating our latest seafaring video. We're sharing that with the tribes along the Chesapeake Bay. And we'll let you know in the next series how they are responding to that.
But that's a terrific question.
Well, I think a little bit to the north of that with the Wabanakis, as especially the original Seekers of the Lost Red Paint people made a big impact with the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots.
Okay, talk to you.
And at that point, people started actually looking for information and evidence in their own memory, in that of their ancestors, so as to be able to understand that. And one of my favorite stories is the one that was just picked up, I think, after Ted's red paint video came out, was the story of the big seafaring ferry that went from Maine up to Digby, Nova Scotia. It was way out in the middle of where the Gulf of Maine turns to the Bay of Fundy, completely out of sight of land. And the big ferry was going out, and they saw this little dot way off in the distance. And the mate went up on the deck, got a pair of binoculars and put them on and looked out. And there was this tiny little canoe going up in the huge swells out there. And they said, "Oh my God, somebody's in that canoe. They must be, in terrible condition." So the whole ferry, of course, stopping a ferry, and turning it over, moving it over to try to do a rescue, was took a long time. So when they finally got over closer, they looked down, and there was I think it was a Maliseet gentleman, was in his canoe, and he was just not moving. And the captain or whoever screamed at him, "Man, are you in trouble? Can we do anything for you? Is there anything you need?" The guy looks around, scratches the back of his head, looks up, said, "Well, I could use a match for my pipe." And so there's a story.
As an educator, I am very curious to learn how we can get this film and information into our youth's curricula. It is vital for children to learn their history, especially that of the Americas. Thank you for your presentation today.
The easiest way is to go to my website, twtimreck.com, go to the page that has the Hidden Landscape series, and get it right there. I think that information is on the Nolumbika website as well. But that's thank you, and that's the quickest way.
But I'd like to reiterate that it starts with you, the teacher, asking the question and demanding an answer. So you got the answer from Ted Timreck. What will you do with it?
And I think this is our last question. And after this, I would like the panelists, if they have anything to add, to do so. How do you imagine these scientific discoveries might advance the work of unerasure and restoration of right relationship? What can allies do?
Well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that the history that we've been fed is incorrect, and then start the process of correcting it. And you, the teacher, are the one who starts that process.
Well, I think, at least in the Wabanaki in general and the Abenaki situation in particular, this understanding of a deeper and more complex ceremonial history gets us away from a very stereotypic cultural simplicity that Ted referred to at the beginning. We've suffered forever, ever since Lewis Henry Morgan published his work on the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, that the New England tribes were somehow poor cousins culturally to more advanced societies, I guess you could say, off to the west and the south of us. And I think for me and my mission to achieve parity with other supposedly more powerful slash culturally advanced, quote end quote, cultures. The work that we've been doing with Ted for the last 20 years or so is absolutely critical. Now we've completely changed all of the way that we're portraying the archaic and even the certain parts of the Paleo-Indian, reinterpreting this area as basically going from a maritime archaic, advanced, at least high band level, maybe low level ranked or chieftainship society through Adina Hopewell, getting toward real genuine civilization expressed up here that persisted right through such things as the Great Council Fire, which was an alliance of the contact period that stretched from Newfoundland to the shadows of the Rockies, much larger than the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, and larger even than the Roman Empire. But nobody knows, nobody cares. So this whole reinterpretation that Ted and Doug and everybody, all of us are working on in the Paleo-Indian is now going on in the archaic and even historic period. So our goal, and my goal before I pass, is to say we don't have to take backseat to anybody.
The only thing I can add to that is, as you can tell from the direction of the movies, understanding what long distance maritime capabilities with 80-man canoes, what that represents in terms of social structure and social dynamics and evolution of culture is an enormously different picture than what our textbooks tell us about native life in New England from the Ice Age on. And if you can bring that kind of information to an audience, native and non-native, and try to show the ways that that kind of an adaptation, traveling thousands and thousands of miles, connecting people over long stretches, that is a different level of human civilization than what our textbooks tell us. And that's why I've emphasized the maritime as strongly as I have. I mean, God knows that the ceremonialism is beautiful and poignant, but trying to figure out the kinds of culture that develop that relationship to the land and the sky is the important aspect of the next step. And hopefully that can be done, probably in another generation or two. But just the same, we have to start with scientists accepting this different kind of image of Native America along the Atlantic coast first.
This is Doug. I was once on a bus in New York City and got the shock of my life when the DNA evidence was sitting in a seat in front of me. It was a young lady with straight black hair, ebony black skin, and blue eyes. And that told me a great deal that I needed to ever know about what DNA, how DNA surfaces and how the multiculturalism of DNA surfaces. But we have to be willing to look, and we have to be willing to interpret from a model other than the one that we were fed as children.
Well, thank you very much for attending the film and listening to this fascinating question and answer period. We want to thank Lisa McLaughlin, our engineer, and Diane Dix, who was handling the question and answer period. One of the things I want you to note is that we are aware, the three panelists and the rest of the Nolambika people, we're aware that the series has raised a lot of questions about how you, the public, could work in protecting sites in your community, and also how to bring this information into the classroom. So we're developing some suggestions and resources that we could share with you over the next few weeks as we continue our film series. We have 2 more films to show you from the Ted Timreck inventory, one being next week called The New Antiquarians, working together to unlock the mysteries of stone ruins. And this film follows archaeologists and amateur analysts, native preservation personnel, as they bring a new level of cooperation into the examination of stone ruins found throughout the Northeast here. The guest panelists will be Evan Pritchard, who is of Mi'kmaq descent. He is the director of the Center for Algonquin Studies, and he'll be the guest panelist. He's author of more than 50 books and has taught courses in Native American Studies at Marist, Vassar, and Pace colleges. So from all of us at Nolambika, from Lisa McLaughlin, our engineer, and our 3 panelists, Doug, Ted, and Fred, we wish you a good continuation of your weekend, and we hope we'll see you next week, next Saturday, same time for our next film. Thank you all for attending.